As tensions continue to increase between China and the U.S., Washington has taken a number of steps to enhance its military presence and capabilities in the Indo-Pacific region. One major part of this effort has been to establish a more versatile launchpad for potential American military actions, just in case a conflict were to erupt between, let's say China and Taiwan. And as this scenario looks increasingly possible, if not inevitable, the Western Pacific islands of Tinian and Guam have been placed front and center on the international stage. The tiny island of Tinian hasn't received much attention since its crucial role as a B-29 base during World War II, but it's currently a big part of the U.S. Air Force's effort to increase operational readiness in case of unprovoked Chinese hostilities. For one, the North Airfield on Tinian has undergone extensive revitalization and redevelopment, as it's been slowly being reclaimed from the jungle after being abandoned by the U.S. Army Air Force in 1946. This project, aimed at transforming the once unusable airfield into a fully operational facility, is just one part of the Air Force's Agile Combat Employment Strategy, also known as ACE, which was introduced in August 2021. According to official Air Force doctrine, this strategy, which also involves Guam and several other nearby islands, is a proactive and reactive operational scheme designed to increase survivability while generating combat power. If applied correctly, the ACE strategy should 1. Complicate the enemy's targeting process, 2. Create political and operational dilemmas for the enemy, and 3. Create flexibility in operations that include friendly forces. This has required re-examining a wide variety of systems, including but not limited to command and control, air and missile defense, and offensive and defensive space and cyber capabilities. All of this adds up to an increasingly more resilient opposition for the Chinese. Unlike Tinian, Guam has been a crucial U.S. military asset ever since it was recaptured from the Japanese after a bloody 21-day battle in the summer of 1944. For the rest of World War II, Guam was actively employed as a base for B-29s. Currently, major bases on Guam are Andersen Air Force Base, which has remained a home for long-range bombers, and APRA Naval Base Guam, home to a submarine squadron and frequently used as a waypoint for other warships. The island's bases host some 7,000 U.S. military personnel, while thousands more are expected to arrive this year. However, America's strong military presence in Guam also has made the island a target. North Korea has threatened it specifically in the past. Western military planners also consider it to be a key strategic target for the Chinese. If Beijing ever wanted to neutralize U.S. bases in the region prior to or during a hypothetical invasion of Taiwan. Although isolated and thinly populated, American territories like Guam and Tinian possess major strategic power. This is why U.S. lawmakers and military commanders in the Asia-Pacific region have long emphasized their importance in terms of countering China's influence. These islands, as well as Japan, Taiwan, and the Philippines, are essential as both support and attack points, and many of these island bases already can host command and control elements, support Air Force attack squadrons, and store large quantities of munitions and fuel. But China knows this too, and has made their own attempts to win over many of these small island nations, not only to undermine the larger international security concerns of the U.S., but also as part of its desire to further isolate Taiwan in preparation for a possible invasion. China has never accepted Taiwan as an independent country. However, this is not only the current leader Xi Jinping's idea, it's actually written into the Constitution of the People's Republic of China. Since the infamous Mao Zedong, every leader has supported the PRC's goal of reunifying the two nations. But while the communist China of the past believed it could simply wait for Taiwan, a small island of just 24 million people, 160 kilometers off the coast of southern China, to be drawn back in by the mainland's massive economy and 1.4 billion strong population, that no longer seems to be a realistic option. As Beijing has grown increasingly impatient, Taiwan has developed into a sturdy democracy with a political culture that starkly contrasts China's current autocratic system. While it doesn't exactly fit the traditional model of a dictatorship, where power is concentrated in the hands of a single individual, the Communist Party of China maintains tight control over the government, the military, media, and civil society. Over the past few decades, the Taiwanese have become even more determined not to reunify. This leaves China with only one option: take Taiwan by force. But to America and its many allies in Asia, this course of action would be totally unacceptable. If Beijing could reel Taiwan back in without using violence, corruption, or coercion, the leadership in Washington would simply have to accept that. But anything else would likely lead to war. Sometimes the possibility of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan looks inevitable, a matter of when rather than if, with a conflict kicking off sometime in 2025 or 2027. Other military analysts, however, have argued the likelihood of war remains quite low. Still, others say that if China were to attack Taiwan, much of the blame could be placed on the deteriorating relationship between Beijing and Washington. A lot of the tension surrounding Taiwan comes from the growing conflict between these two major global powers. For one, Beijing doesn't like at all that Taiwan has fallen within the sphere of U.S. influence, but it also must recognize that any military action against Taiwan would be viewed as a direct attack on U.S. interests. This also means, however, that if China-U.S. relations completely fall apart, Xi Jinping won't have to worry about the feelings of whoever's occupying the White House when he ultimately makes his move on Taiwan. And yet, as they continue to increase their presence and capabilities in the Pacific, the U.S. military puts more and more pressure on an increasingly nervous Chinese leadership. If backed into a corner or faced with the reality that he might lose his opportunity to take Taiwan for good, it's hard to say what Xi Jinping might do. With that said, when assessing the probability of this war actually breaking out, the complex political relationship between the U.S. and China will be important to keep an eye on, but other factors need to be considered as well. It's no secret Taiwan is the most prominent figure in the semiconductor industry, and if China were to disrupt these supply chains, it would cost the world economy trillions of dollars per year, not to mention the larger-scale economic war that would almost certainly kick off if China attacked Taiwan, a war that would likely hit China's economy harder than the West's or anyone else's. And as time goes by, it's hard to imagine that Xi Jinping and his party haven't strongly considered this. That does not, however, give us permission to relax completely. We cannot ignore the fact that China has been ramping up its military efforts too. Not only has China increased its Navy presence around Taiwan, but for years now, it's been actively developing a series of anti-ship ballistic missiles, intermediate-range ballistic missiles, and land attack cruise missiles that can be launched from both air and sea platforms. Among the most worrisome are the Dongfang 21D and Dongfang 26, which have been dubbed the Guam Killer or Guam Express due to their 4,000-kilometer range. China's newest missile, though, the DF-27, is even scarier. With a range of up to 8,000 kilometers, it can fly as far as Hawaii while easily penetrating current U.S. missile defenses, making it a particularly serious threat to U.S. bases and aircraft carriers. These new hypersonic missiles, like the DF-27, are uniquely deadly for two reasons. One, they can maneuver all along their trajectory, making them nearly impossible to defend against. And two, they can operate in a totally different region of the atmosphere than other similar missiles. These new hypersonic systems can fly much higher than the slower subsonic missiles, but much lower than intercontinental ballistic missiles, which means fewer countries have the ability to effectively track them, including ones that currently possess them: China, the US, and Russia. The Kremlin's already come out and said that some of its hypersonic weapons can carry a nuclear warhead, which is terrifying whether it's true or not, because now if Russia ever launched one of these against an enemy, that country would have to guess whether the warhead attached was conventional or nuclear, and its hypersonic speed would only increase the precariousness of the situation dramatically, because there'd be little to no time for any last-minute diplomatic negotiations. What this really means is that it's in everyone's best interest to not completely isolate Russia and China, but keep them at the negotiating table in the hopes of coming to some sort of agreement about the management of these new weapons. But to do this, the Pentagon would likely need to hurry up and develop its own stockpile of hypersonic missiles, with some ready for immediate use in the Pacific theater. And this is exactly what they've been doing. Earlier this year, the Air Force completed its first Pacific-based hypersonic cruise missile test at the Reagan Test Site at Kwajalein Atoll in the Marshall Islands, around 2,600 kilometers east of Guam. Officially known as the all-up-round AGM-183A Air-Launched Rapid Response Weapon, or thankfully the ARRW for short, this system consists of a rocket booster motor and a hypersonic glide vehicle that carries a conventional warhead. Similar to China's DF-27, a hypersonic glide vehicle like this can travel at speeds greater than Mach 5, over 6,400 kilometers per hour. However, the U.S. is way behind in deploying this technology. China's been testing hypersonic glide vehicles that can carry both nuclear and conventional warheads since 2014. North Korea also claims to be developing similar hypersonic weapons, while it's been said that Russia has already used a Zircon hypersonic cruise missile on the battlefields of Ukraine. Though the Air Force didn't give any specifics, some experts have speculated that this recent test was intended to send a clear message to Beijing, reaffirming Washington's commitment to strengthening its strategic presence in the Pacific, while also stepping up as an active player in the hypersonic missile arena to keep pace with Russia and China. One could easily assume that China's ongoing development of hypersonic weapons has greatly inspired the American military to expand both its offensive and defensive capabilities in the Indo-Pacific theater, both to protect its assets, if needed, and to deter Chinese aggression aimed at Taiwan. With few signs that the U.S. and China will come to an agreement anytime soon, preparations for a potential conflict will continue being made throughout the region. After almost 4 centuries as part of the Kingdom of Spain, Guam became an American territory in 1898 when the Spanish-American War ended, and Spain ceded Guam to the U.S. as part of the Treaty of Paris. During World War I, though, it played a minor strategic role. Guam was where the first violent action by the U.S. took place, where the first shots were fired by the U.S. against Germany, where the U.S. captured the first German prisoners of war, and where the first Germans were killed in action by U.S. forces. Years later, on the same day as the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese army would invade and occupy Guam, and until U.S. forces ultimately liberated the island 31 months later, Guam's indigenous population would be subjected to forced labor, family separation, incarceration, execution, concentration camps, and forced prostitution. Approximately 1,000 Guamanian civilians died during the occupation, around 5% of the total population. Tinian also played a significant role in World War II. After U.S. forces captured it in the summer of 1944, it became host of the largest B-29 bomber fleet in the Pacific. Prior to the war, this volcanic island, about 200 kilometers north of Guam, with a max elevation of around 187 meters, was administered by Japan and operated as a major sugarcane growing and sugar processing center. But after it was captured by the U.S., Tinian was converted into a military air base and equipped with what were then the world's longest runways. The Tinian North Airfield would be famously used in August 1945 as the launching point for the specially outfitted B-29s that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In the wake of World War II, the U.S. officially acquired Tinian, one of the 3 principal islands of the Commonwealth of the North Mariana Islands, as part of the Trust Territory of the Pacific Islands, a trustee administered by the United Nations. Since then, a large part of the island has been leased by the U.S. military, but the economy of Tinian has consisted mostly of small-scale vegetable cultivation for export to Guam and a small beef cattle industry. As mentioned before, the ongoing revival of Tinian's North Field and other facilities comes as a part of the Air Force's ACE strategy, which involves shifting operations from large, centralized bases to a network of smaller, widely dispersed locations, an approach largely aimed at complicating enemy planning and creating greater flexibility for joint force operations. Currently, the majority of U.S. air power in the Pacific is concentrated at a few large bases, namely Andersen Air Force Base in Guam and Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, Japan. This heavy concentration of assets, however, leaves the Air Force vulnerable to a devastating attack. But for the ACE strategy to work as intended, the U.S. will need to secure footholds and develop airstrips on dozens of small islands throughout the Pacific, such as Tinian, Palau, and Saipan, all of which are less than 520 square kilometers. In recent years, most of these islands have hosted troops and undergone millions of dollars worth of renovations. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been spent expanding the military capacity of Guam, Tinian, and Basa Air Base in the Philippines. The U.S. Army also helped build an airstrip in Palau back in 2020. The massive restoration effort to develop Tinian's North Airfield has included runway restoration, the establishment of a fuel pipeline system, and the building of a parking apron to accommodate fighter jets, bombers, and support aircraft. The Air Force also recently revealed its future plans to upgrade facilities on the tiny island of Yap, which lies between Guam and Palau, some 1,600 kilometers southeast of China. Beginning with an initial investment of $96 million in 2025, the Air Force's fiscal year 2025 budget calls for a $400 million total investment to extend Yap's runway in both directions and construct various other support facilities. According to the official budget request for the Air Force's military construction program, the extended runway on Yap is required to enable increased capacity of the runway by allowing larger aircraft to land and take off quickly and safely. If approved, construction should begin in August 2025. In the midst of its many restoration and improvement projects, The U.S. military has also been preparing its forces in other ways, just in case hostilities, likely provoked by China, do erupt in the Pacific region. Back in 2021, for example, the Air Force deployed some 25 F-22 Raptors to Guam and Tinian as part of Operation Pacific Iron, an exercise in the Western Pacific that analysts say should send a clear message to potential adversaries by highlighting both the Air Force's adaptability and commitment to regional security. 2 squadrons of these 5th-generation stealth fighters, more than China has in its entire inventory, were deployed from the Hawaii Air National Guard and Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, Alaska for the exercise. In total, the Air Force has around 180 F-22s in its fleet, but due to maintenance requirements, only about half of those are mission-capable at any one time. Operation Pacific Iron also included the mobilization of 10 F-15 Strike Eagle fighters from Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho and 2 C-130 Hercules transport planes from Yokota Air Base in Japan. Though this was just an exercise, it showcased many of the same tactics and logistical procedures we could expect to see during an actual defensive operation launched from Japan, Guam, or elsewhere, which should at least make one thing clear to Chinese military planners. That's the sort of F-22 force package that could be deployed in a hurry to almost anywhere in the Pacific. The Pacific Air Forces, a major U.S. command responsible for all air and space operations in the Pacific region, also recently held its yearly COPE North training exercise in the Northern Mariana Islands. As the largest multinational exercise of its kind, COPE North typically includes the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marine Corps, along with allied nations like Japan, Australia, and others. The exercise focuses on enhancing cooperation and readiness among international military forces, using various training scenarios, including air combat, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief operations. Originally held in Okinawa, Japan, but relocated to Guam in 1978, this year's COPE North 24 specifically included training situations and joint operations that utilize Tinian International Airport and Tinian's North Field. For many of these scenarios, various military forces, including the U.S. Marines, the Royal Australian Air Force, and the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force, engaged in ACE-oriented operations designed to enhance operational readiness and survivability in remote environments. Other training scenarios included mass casualty events and extreme scenarios, such as aircraft crashes, designed to test the participants' operational effectiveness during a crisis. During many of these scenarios, differences in terminology and procedures were continually addressed to ensure smooth coordination among participating nations. The ongoing advancement and innovation of exercises like COPE North, which are uniquely designed to strengthen alliances and improve collective warfighting capabilities, will be crucial in the years to come, especially if the U.S. finds itself in a hot war with China and its allies. Suppose a war with China does break out, though. Along with all of its other extensive preparations, it seems the U.S. will do what it's long tended to do when the going gets tough. It'll send in the Marines. At least that's the impression one might take away from the recent reactivation of Guam's Camp Blas, which will soon be home to some 5,000 Marines, while also serving as a strategic hub for the Indo-Pacific region. The reactivation of Camp Blas comes as part of the U.S. Marine Corps' long-standing plan to move approximately 9,000 Marines from Okinawa, which is currently home to more than 18,000 Marines, as part of a 2012 bilateral agreement between the U.S. and Japan to reduce U.S. military presence on the island. Previously known as Marine Barracks Guam, Camp Blas was named for Brigadier General Vicente Thomas Ben Garrido Blas, the first person indigenous to the Mariana Islands to become a general officer in the Marine Corps. The camp was previously deactivated in 1992. This and other events have made it increasingly clear that the future of Guam is inseparable from the future of the broader region, which has prompted the Marine Corps, among other branches, to shift its attention toward threats from China and the security of the Pacific Theater and the islands it contains. For their part, the leadership of the Marine Corps introduced an initiative called Force Design 2030, a sweeping 10-year overhaul of the branch prompted by the threat of war with China and marked by the positioning of large numbers of Marines around the Pacific region, in the hopes of deterring Chinese aggression against Taiwan. First introduced in March 2020, the goal of Force Design 30 is to optimize the Corps for naval expeditionary warfare and become better aligned with the U.S.'s overall national defense strategy, with a focus on outmaneuvering China and Russia in particular. Described as an ambitious overhaul of the Marine Corps, the overall long-term aim of Force Design 2030 is to make the service more nimble and less vulnerable. Critics of this policy have said that Force Design 2030 is too focused on China, leaving the U.S. unprepared for possible conflicts elsewhere. Supporters of the initiative, however, don't see the harm in trying to rattle the Chinese leadership by placing a few thousand Marines on Beijing's doorstep. But if that isn't enough to deter China from trying to take Taiwan, and the war in the Western Pacific becomes inevitable, it's tough to exactly say what role the Marines would play in the fight. If China attacked, would the Pentagon actually put U.S. boots on the ground in defense of Taiwan? And if so, will they be ready in time? The CIA estimates that if Xi Jinping does initiate action against Taiwan, it'll happen sometime in 2027. And according to certain U.S. national security experts, there are a number of ways this conflict could play out. The details of those predictions, however, which were gathered largely through the use of highly sophisticated war games, have been classified. But one bipartisan think tank based in Washington, D.C., called the Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, recently organized its own series of games, and they were happy to share their results. After running the scenario of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan 24 separate times, analysts found that in most cases an allied force made up primarily of the U.S., Japan, and Taiwan would be able to overpower Chinese forces and secure Taiwan's independence. During a conventional amphibious invasion, Chinese troops would be able to land on the southern beaches of Taiwan and begin moving inland. But faced with heavy Taiwanese resistance, they would not be able to establish a significant presence on shore or move their forces farther north toward Taipei. During 4 weeks of fighting, most of China's amphibious fleet would be destroyed by relentless U.S. attacks, thus weakening their ability to bring more troops or supplies ashore. Eventually, China's forces would get worn down, and the Taiwanese would push them back, while likely taking a large number of prisoners of war. In nearly every scenario, China lost more than 100 warships and tens of thousands of soldiers. Failing to occupy Taiwan while sustaining such heavy losses would also likely raise serious doubts about the competency of the Chinese Communist Party, the analysts predicted, and lead to long-term destabilization. The U.S. and its allies would lose dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and tens of thousands of troops, while their bases on Guam and Japan would be mostly destroyed, and Taiwan's economy would be largely devastated. Such losses would damage the U.S.'s global position for many years, they predicted, making the only real victory here the fact that Taiwan was able to remain an independent nation. This war would likely last until both sides were exhausted, resulting in an unstable peace with the looming possibility of future conflicts. There's also the terrifying possibility of nuclear escalation, which is the case with any war that involves two nuclear powers. At the end of each scenario, it was perfectly clear that avoiding war altogether would be the best for both sides. The cost of victory would be too high, meaning both sides would be likely better off pursuing some sort of diplomatic solution. This means that for the U.S. and its allies, deterrence via a strong show of force is the best strategy for now. But what do you think? Is a war between China and Taiwan inevitable? What would deter China from acting against Taiwan? Would a U.S.-Taiwan coalition win that fight? Let us know in the comments, and then check out what would happen if China and the U.S. went to war hour by hour. Or watch this video instead.